Thank you so much for your patience. We will wait a couple of minutes more. You know we were pulled to votes, right, when the committee was supposed to begin. We just finished votes, so it might take a couple of more minutes for people to come over. We'll give them a little bit longer, and then we'll get started. Oh, okay. Your Excellency. Good afternoon, everyone. This hearing for the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony, and the title of our hearing is Africa Looking Forward, U.S.-Africa Relations. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I will now make an opening statement and then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on looking forward, U.S.-Africa relations. Basically, we're here to ask what U.S. engagement with African countries should look like moving forward. We mentioned in the first hearing that we wanted to take our first few hearings as an opportunity to really provide an overview of the jurisdiction that this committee covers. And recognizing that the only two members on this committee that have been on this committee for a while We had all new members, and so for that reason wanted to take a step back and really provide an overview. The African continent is comprised of 50-plus countries and more than 1.2 billion culturally distinct peoples in different geographic regions. This diversity results in diverging political, economic, and social experiences across the continent. This means that our policy has to take that diversity into consideration. The continent cannot be painted with one brush. After years of democratic progress, African democracies have faced ups and downs. Some countries are progressing while others appear to be backsliding. Meanwhile, African citizens favor democracy and continue to take to the streets to demand responsive and accountable governance. How do we encourage countries to support the desire for democracy by their citizens? What tools should we be using? Regarding issues around good governance, democracy, and human rights, there are a number of countries that I look forward to hearing about in your testimony or in the Q&A. Cameroon is very concerning at the moment, and the government's reaction to protest in Sudan is also an area of concern. In addition, sub-Saharan Africa is experiencing major demographic changes, including a youth bulge and urbanization. People aged 35 and under account for more than 75% of Africa's population, with the continent expected to become the world region with the highest urbanization. While the continent is undergoing this major urban transition and youth bulge, some of the world's fastest growing economies are in African countries. In fact, several international observers have named the continent the future economic growth engine of the world. Other nations are deepening their relationships with countries across Africa, and instead of critiquing, we have to find ways to show up and engage. I look forward to hearing witnesses' recommendations on what this engagement should entail. Most of you know that I advocate for increased trade, investment, and business activity between Africa and the U.S. From my perspective, this is a win-win situation. We help U.S. businesses gain access to new markets while creating jobs and building capacity across Africa. And we know that this is increasingly essential given the youth bulge. We are often critical of China's involvement on the continent, and I'm not sure what we expect the African countries to do, but the solution that I like to promote is that the United States needs to step up. In his December 2018 public remarks, National Security Advisor Bolton identified 3 core U.S. interests in Africa: expanding U.S. trade and commercial ties with African countries, countering the threat from terrorism and violent conflict, and imposing more stringent conditions on U.S. aid and UN peacekeeping missions in the region. My hope is that the witnesses can highlight other areas that we should focus on when we consider U.S.-Africa relations. I have been disappointed that the administration has not emphasized democracy, good governance, or human rights. That said, the administration has maintained most Africa-focused aid initiatives launched by previous Congresses, and in some cases have sought to fund them, however, at far lower levels. These include the Global President's Emergency Plan for AIDS, or PEPFAR, and Feed the Future, and Africa-specific Young African Leaders Initiatives and Electrify Africa. Electrify Africa and Feed the Future were initiatives that were put into statute by the former chair, Ed Royce, and I'm glad that those initiatives have continued, but concerned about the cuts in funding. I will conclude by stressing that U.S. relations with Africa has always enjoyed bipartisan support here in Congress, and we expect to continue to work together. Each time the administration has sought to reduce funding to State Department or USAID, especially those that would impact African countries, we have worked together in a bipartisan manner to restore that funding. I now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank our witnesses for coming forward today and spending time with us. I believe I speak for all of us when I say that the importance of U.S. engagement in Africa cannot be overstated. I was pleased to see the administration recognize this and release a dedicated Africa strategy in December. It's critical for the American people to understand our interest in Africa and for Africa to see our commitment to the continent. In my opinion, the strategy goes a long way in both respects. In recent years, policy and debate on Africa has centered on counterterrorism, foreign assistance, conservation, women empowerment and development, good governance, and human rights, among other things. While I'm proud of the progress we've made in our counterterrorism efforts, we must continue to be proactive, particularly in the Sahel. As we've seen in the Middle East, left unchecked, extremist organizations have the potential to carry out deadly attacks across the globe and spur tragic humanitarian crises as people flee from harm's way. The same can be said on development and women empowerment. The BUILD Act and the Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empower Act, which were both signed into law last Congress, will have a tremendous impact, but we must do more. Africa continues to grapple with high poverty rates, food insecurity, insufficient health care and education systems, and infrastructure deficiencies. Addressing these issues is not only in the best interest of Africans, but in the best interest of Americans. For this reason, I introduced the Digital Global Access Policy Act, which promotes expanding internet access in developing countries and in turn will help Africa overcome many problems I just mentioned. It is my hope that this committee and the House of Representatives will soon take up this critical legislation. While many of the previous issues I've highlighted will continue to dominate our efforts in Africa, we must turn our attention towards countering China and Russia as they expand their financial and political influence across the continent. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China has secured significant leverage over many African countries and access to Africa's precious natural resources. China's construction of its first overseas military base in Djibouti is also a cause for concern given its close proximity to ours. We see similar interest from Russia, albeit even more defense-focused. Checking Chinese and Russian investment and influence in the region and the rest of the world is critical to U.S. national security. We cannot write blank checks or discount requirements that come along with U.S. assistance, but we must think critically and innovatively about how we can offer an alternative. I look forward to what will certainly be a productive and enlightening discussion about our next steps in Africa. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ranking Member. I now want to introduce our witnesses. First, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield. She joined ASG as a senior counselor after serving as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs from 2013 to 2017. In this capacity, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield led U.S. policy towards sub-Saharan Africa with a focus on peace and security, democracy and governance, economic empowerment, and investment opportunities. Prior to this appointment, she served as Director General of the Foreign Service and Director of Human Resources, where she oversaw all personnel functions for the U.S. Department of State's 70,000-strong workforce. Previously, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield served as the U.S. Ambassador to Liberia from 2008 to 2012 and held posts in several other African nations. Ambassador Thomas Greenfield is also a distinguished resident fellow in African Affairs at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Dr. Coulibaly is a senior fellow and director of the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institute. His research focuses on creating economic opportunities and prosperity in sub-Saharan Africa by improving development finance, global trade, monetary policies, and banking, financial institutions, and markets. His most recent work includes the research papers, Mobilization of Tax Revenues in Africa, Meeting Africa's Employment Challenges in the Changing World, as well as serving as the editor for the initiative's annual flagship report, Foresight Africa, Top Priorities for the Continent. Joshua Mesferli is a senior fellow policy analyst, Africa and the Middle East at the Heritage Foundation. He specializes in African geopolitics, counterterrorism, and refugee policy. In 2009, he joined Church World Service based out of Nairobi, Kenya, and traveled extensively in East and Southern Africa interviewing refugees. He ended his time as CSW as field team manager, responsible for a multinational team of nearly 100 staff. In 2012, he worked at the U.S. Army Special Operations Command and helped write an Army concept paper. He is the lead author of a monograph on al-Shabaab's insurgency, and his other work has appeared in many other publications. I want to thank the witnesses for taking the time. Again, I want to thank you for your patience, apologize for the delay, and ask you to begin your testimony. We don't have a clock. I will be keeping track on my trusty iPhone here, and we'll notify you when 5 minutes are up. I know that you all have written testimony that you have submitted, so if within 5 minutes, if you could summarize your testimony, and could you begin, Madam Ambassador?
Thank you very much. I'll do my best. Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Wright, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify at this important hearing on the future of United States policy toward Africa. Allow me to thank all of you for your commitment and service to Africa, and some of you for your support during my tenure as Assistant Secretary from 2013 to 2017. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the dreadful situation in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe as a result of Cyclone Idai, which has led to hundreds of deaths and thousands of displacement and millions of dollars in destruction. This should be at the forefront of our thinking on Africa today. 2019 is a critical time for Africa policy. There have been a series of long-term trends and recent developments which have put the continent at the forefront like never before. That is why it is crucial that there be sustained and consistent U.S. engagement on the continent. The U.S. has consistently shown great bipartisan leadership on African issues. The bipartisan focus of our government led to the passing of programs as Congresswoman Bass mentioned, such as the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the President's Malaria Initiative, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, YALI, the Millennium Challenge Account, Feed the Future. All of these programs have withstood the test across administrations. And these programs are laced with our value system at the core: democracy, good governance, human rights, and prosperity, all of which made the U.S. a major player on the continent of Africa. The positive bipartisan engagement with Africa continues with the current administration's Build Act and Prosper Africa initiatives. These initiatives seek to further strengthen trade ties with the still burgeoning African market full of opportunities. The United States brings many resources to the table that other countries do not. The United States hosts a large and vibrant Africa diaspora community who have made significant contributions to America, both economically and socially. And as we commemorate the 400-year anniversary since the first Africans arrived to this land in bondage, we must remember the deep historical connections between the U.S. and Africa. Allow me to touch briefly on a few issues we should address. My full testimony is provided in writing and gives a more fulsome list. First, Congresswoman Bass, you mentioned the youth bulge. Africa is facing an unprecedented demographic evolution with half the population under the age of 19. Estimates are that by 2050, the population of the African continent will have doubled from 1.2 billion to 2.5 billion, representing a quarter of the world's population. It is vital that the United States work to help African countries use this growth to foster prosperity. Security and terrorism, maybe one of the most critical areas of collaboration with African states, involves security. Continued U.S. engagement with African stakeholders to tackle these threats is necessary. The proposed reduction of 10% of American troops deployed on the continent sends the wrong message to our partners. On democracy and democratic transition, the fact that the National Security Advisor did not mention democracy in his December Africa policy speech did not go unnoticed on the continent. The United States must continue to promote democracy programs across the continent. In the long term, democracy contributes to better governance, human development, security, and economic growth. Climate change. It is important that we engage African policymakers on climate change and adopting environmentally conscious policies. Renewed international commitments to elements of the Paris Climate Change Agreement would benefit Africa's efforts to address some of the environmental changes it now faces. And while I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to engage on the entire continent, there are some countries that I believe decision makers should prioritize. First, Nigeria. The importance of the most populous country in sub-Saharan Africa and its #1 economy is self-evident. As President Buhari embarks on his second and final term, the U.S. needs to remain supportive of reforms that will help entrench democratic values. South Africa. will hold elections on May of this year, and as the next administration in South Africa deals with institutional corruption and the tricky waters of land redistribution, the U.S. needs to support the country's transition to let the South African people know we're standing side by side with them. Ethiopia. Ethiopia is an example of the profound change that African countries can go through quickly with principled leaders at the helm. The United States should ramp up its engagement with the government of Ethiopia to ensure these reforms continue unhindered and that they become institutionalized within Ethiopia. The United States should not squander the opportunity to build closer relationships with this vital player. South Sudan. In South Sudan, the U.S. has fallen behind on diplomatic leadership, and I believe we have abdicated responsibility for a state we helped birth. The United States should designate a special envoy to provide U.S. leadership who can work with leaders in the region to break the cycle of continued conflict in South Sudan. I welcome in DRC the appointment of Dr. Peter Pham as a special envoy for the Great Lakes region of Africa in November of 2018. It is important following the election that the U.S. continue to engage with the Congolese president. And I see you're about to grab, so I'm going to skip, but I have mentioned Ghana, and I do mention Tanzania, Sudan, Cameroon, that I know in particular that you think is very important. But finally, let me just say that to achieve our goals in Africa around the globe, we must have sustained, strong diplomatic efforts. The recent visit of Deputy Secretary Sullivan to South Africa and Angola and Assistant Secretary Nodge to Cameroon, DRC, Rwanda, and Uganda highlight the type of engagement that is needed. But they need help from more senior officials in the administration to engage. And I think for this reason, it's time for a second Africa Leaders Summit. And also, we have too many ambassadorships in Africa that are still vacant, and many of them in some of these important countries that I mentioned. And in order for us to have successful engagement with the African continent, we need to invest in more diplomatic presence on the ground, particularly our ambassadors. Ultimately, the United States should take a more positive, proactive approach to Africa, emphasizing the potential of the continent rather than its risk. It is absolutely in the interest of the United States to see the continent of Africa grow and thrive. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kalubi.
Thank you, Madam Chair Bass and Ranking Member Wrights. So let me begin by applauding your leadership as well as that of Congressman Smith and your active role in fostering the bipartisan collaboration that has traditionally characterized U.S. legislation on Africa. And my appreciation to the members of the committee for the opportunity to share my views on the subject. This is indeed an opportune time to really assess the future of U.S.-Africa relations because there's emerging consensus, which I share, that the U.S. is falling behind in Africa. In my view, this is not because U.S. policies toward Africa have failed. In fact, and I was mentioned earlier, U.S. policies and programs such as AGOA, PEPFAR, the Malaria Initiative, Power Africa, YALI, have all been successful and impactful overall. But rather it's because Africa is transforming rapidly and the architecture of our engagement needs to adapt to this dynamism and to the evolving aspiration of the African countries. So following a period of political and social instability as well as weak economic growth, Africa's fortunes began to turn around the year 2000. Since then, thanks to better domestic policies and favorable global environment, economic growth has been strong, boosting commercial opportunities. Importantly, Africa is experiencing a demographic boom and rapid urbanization. By the turn of the century, 40% of the world's population and 42% of its workforce will be African. And to better respond to the growing needs of the populations, Africa's leadership and institutions are becoming more assertive in the ownership and advancement of the continent's agenda. The unprecedented dynamism on the continent is creating tremendous commercial opportunities in trade and investments, and it is not an exaggeration to say that Africa is on course to be the world's next big growth market. Earlier this month, the cover page of The Economist magazine read "The New Scramble for Africa." It was capturing what those following developments on the continent already knew: commercial opportunities that Africa presents, as well as some of the transnational threats originating from the region, attracting interest from an increasingly diverse group of foreign countries working proactively to strengthen diplomatic, defense, and commercial ties with the continent. The most active foreign countries are non-traditional partners, and their emergence is challenging the partner of choice status that traditional partners, including the United States, have enjoyed. While diplomatic and defense ties are broadening and strengthening, shifts in commercial ties have been the most significant. Between 2010 and 2017, Africa's trade with countries such as Russia, Thailand, Turkey, Indonesia, and China have risen very fast. In contrast, trade with the United States fell by more than half over this period, and the United States is no longer among Africa's top 3 trading partners. Although the United States still has the largest stock of foreign direct investment, this stock has barely increased since 2010, while investment from other countries, particularly China, has increased significantly. So in this new scramble for Africa, what can the United States do to keep up? First, I think the US should articulate a clear, bipartisan, long-term vision for its US-Africa policy following broad consultation with key stakeholders, including US and African businesses, but importantly, the African Union. The vision should align to the extent possible with the African Union's Agenda 2063 and the UN's Agenda 2030 that African countries have adopted. Given increasing interdependencies between defense, diplomacy, and development, the vision should encompass engagements on all 3 dimensions, but with greater emphasis on the commercial ties with the most potential to yield the most significant mutually beneficial outcomes. Second, to accelerate the commercial engagement, the United States should appoint a high-level White House official with a mandate to work across US agencies to advance US commercial policy. Third, the US should initiate a regular high-level summit between the United States and African states. Other external partners, including China, India, Japan, Turkey, the European Union, all have held 2 or more high-level summits in recent years, which have advanced their engagement with Africa. In contrast, the US has held only 1 high-level summit, and that was in 2014. While not a panacea, I believe this recommendation could go a long way to provide the needed clarity, predictability, and stability in US engagement with Africa. The presence of other countries on the continent would only strengthen with time, and the United States does have a solid foundation and a legacy in Africa on which to build. However, without more proactive approaches, the US risks falling further behind. Ultimately, the future of US-Africa relations will be determined more by US policies and actions, or lack thereof, toward Africa than by those of other countries toward Africa. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much.
Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Wright, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify. Thank you as well for your continued focus on and championing of deeper U.S.-Africa ties. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. In my remarks, I'll focus on what I consider to be the 4 most important U.S. strategic priorities in Africa. First, the U.S. must retain sufficient influence and positioning to protect its national interests on the continent. This is an evergreen challenge that has grown more urgent given the rising great and middle power competition in Africa. As is often commented upon, Djibouti is a good example of this problem. Its port is critical to U.S. military operations in East Africa, yet the Chinese government has built such influence there that there is concern the U.S. will be unable to maintain the necessary level of access. The U.S. is also already far behind in the competition to develop and deploy 5G mobile network technology in Africa. The winner of this competition will gain great economic and other advantages. Chinese companies Huawei and ZTE have built most of the existing telecoms infrastructure in Africa, and several large African telecom companies are already negotiating with Huawei on building 5G networks. Huawei and ZTE's dominance in Africa is also an obvious counterintelligence problem for the United States. Relatedly, Chinese companies have built or renovated, or Beijing has financed, at least 63 sensitive government buildings in at least 29 African countries. We should assume most, if not all, of those buildings are bugged or otherwise compromised, as was the Chinese-built African Union headquarters. Second, the U.S. should facilitate regulatory and normative environments that ensure U.S. companies can compete on an even footing in Africa. By 2030, an estimated 19 African economies will be growing by 5% or more per year, and the continent will likely constitute a $3 trillion economy. It will harm the U.S. and ordinary Africans if anti-competitive behavior becomes the norm and further disadvantages U.S. firms. Third, the U.S. should encourage the growth of African democracy. It is the political system that best promotes human flourishing, and shared democratic values facilitate mutually beneficial relationships between the U.S. and other countries. After years of progress on the continent in this regard, there's been worrisome backsliding in a number of countries. Finally, the U.S. must ensure terrorists cannot use Africa as a staging ground for attacks against the U.S. There have been gains against some of the continent's worst groups, but we are also in the midst of a resurgence of terrorist activity in the Sahel region. The Islamic State West Africa province and Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin have been particularly active and vicious. A long-term component of the terrorism problem is the spread of the Wahhabist practice of Islam in Africa. Saudi Arabia in particular has proselytized this fundamentalist practice, important components of which most current Islamist terrorist groups subscribe to. Responding in a constructive way to the problems and prospects of Africa requires a thoughtful, committed approach. In that spirit, I think the U.S. should do the following. This is not a comprehensive list. Assess with which governments it can reasonably expect to have a mutually beneficial partnership. Good candidates should receive a full suite of U.S. engagement, while poor candidates should be more economy of force operations. Assist African countries to become more business-friendly, foster African entrepreneurs, aid African countries to get the best possible deals from Chinese investment, task U.S. embassies with identifying and facilitating commercial opportunities for U.S. companies, foster good governance in Africa by assisting civil society, fighting corruption, and deepening cooperation with non-African allies active on the continent. Create a strategic messaging plan that explains to African countries the benefits of partnering with the United States. Make the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit a routine event, and ensure that the new International Development Finance Corporation achieves its stated purpose of supporting the U.S. in its strategic competition with China. The U.S. already has a strong foundation of African engagement, of which it should be proud, but it also can and should do more. I thank the committee again for doing its part to ensure that U.S. policies protect American interests and contribute to a safe, prosperous, and free Africa. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all three of our witnesses today for your testimony, and would now like to begin with members asking questions. And I actually will hold my questions and ask them last, since I know members have numerous conflicts. So I will go to the ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I was happy to hear you mention Cameroon in your opening statement, because I also have very deep interest there. I have a number of constituents in my district from Cameroon, and I have heard from both sides. And there's a concern that as the resistance in Anglophone Cameroon continues, that security forces of the government of Cameroon will continue to clamp down, which will cause even further growth in resistance, and the whole thing will spiral. And so my question is, what can and should, in your opinion, the United States government do in Cameroon? And Madam, I'm going to ask all of you that question. Madam Ambassador, I'm going to start with you.
Well, thank you very much. I think the first thing that we can do, and this is was already done by Assistant Secretary Nodge, was engage with the government on this issue. I think for a number of months and for the past year, we have ignored what was happening in any consistent way. So Assistant Secretary Nodge was there, and I know that he did raise this issue with the government. I don't know the gist of the conversation, but I can imagine that he expressed our concerns about this issue. I think in the long run, we may have to take some actions against the government and other parties who are committing human rights violations. I'm sure you've seen the pictures that we've all seen coming from that situation, and the pictures are coming from both sides. The atrocities are being committed by both sides, and people should be held accountable for that, to send a strong message that this is not the way you address these kinds of issues.
Dr. Coulibaly.
I would echo of Ambassador Thomas's Greenfield's sentiment for the U.S. to take a stronger stance where it deems that there have been some really violations of the human rights and continuing to put as much pressure on the government as possible to respect the rights of all.
Mr. Maservi.
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues' comments. I think it's very important that the Cameroonian government understand that the U.S. is watching. I think regional engagement is always very important in these sorts of conflicts, so the U.S. should be working very actively with the neighbors and other concerned countries, the African Union. This doubtlessly concerns many African countries, and the U.S. should be playing the unique role that it can as a facilitator and a convener to try to get them working or pulling in the same direction, working with a singular purpose on Cameroon.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Wonderful. Representative Omar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Really excited to see all of you and hear your testimony. Ambassador, I don't know if you remember me, but we met in Minneapolis right after I'd been elected to the Minnesota House. And so as you probably know, there is a little crisis right now that's happening to many of my constituents and friends and neighbors who are from Liberia, who are on a DED status. And I know that in your history that you served as an ambassador to Liberia. And so I wanted to see if we can maybe chat about this particular crisis that is being visited upon many of my constituents. Last week was recess week for us, and so I got home and you know, we visited many workplaces. There are the majority of the Liberians in my district and in Minnesota are healthcare workers. And so one of the places that I visited was assisted living center, where 177 of their employees were DED recipients. And their status ends on the 31st of this month. And so if that's not renewed, most of them are most likely going to be returned back to Liberia. And so I know that there is going to be a great impact on our community. There is going to be a great impact on my district. But I wanted to see if you maybe can help us sort of fully understand the impact that it might have on the folks in Liberia. Do you know how much money in remittances do Liberians here in this country send back to Liberia?
I don't know that exact figure, but I know that it's significant, just as it is across the continent of Africa. It plays a huge role in the economy of Liberia. But I appreciate the question related to Liberians who are beneficiaries of DED. This was an issue that came up numerous times during my tenure as ambassador to Liberia. I will admit that at the time, given the fact that President Sirleaf was president of the country and the country was going through significant transformation in a positive way, that I wanted to encourage Liberians who were living in the U.S. to come back and be part of the success that was Liberia. In the meantime, you know, as I've returned to the U.S., this is a much more comprehensive and bigger issue than Liberia. I met a young Liberian woman last week, in fact, who was a DACA recipient, and she had lived here in the United States since she was 4 years old. She doesn't know anyone in Liberia. She's currently a student at a university here in the United States, doing quite well, interning in Washington, D.C., and she's fearful of what she will find in Liberia. And I tried to encourage her by telling her there was nothing to fear. But it's easy for me to say that sitting here without the fear of being returned to a place that I don't know. I left that discussion with her extraordinarily sympathetic to her plight. And I do believe that as we look at the broader DACA issues related to all of the nationalities here in the United States, that Liberians have to be part of that comprehensive solution. Whether that can happen by the end of March, I don't know. But I do know that if they are to return to Liberia, right now they are going to return to a country that is at peace. But I think the economy there is in a bit of a downfall. And so it will be very, very difficult for these individuals to reintegrate back into Liberia, having been out of Liberia as long as they have been out of Liberia. In addition, their family members who've been dependent on their remittances will no longer have that benefit.
Yeah, and thank you for that broad overview of the issue. And that brings me actually to the second question I was going to ask you, is that while you say it's at peace, many of my constituents and my friends and neighbors say that it is not economically or physically safe for them to return. And we know that an assessment usually is done for a country before we decide to terminate the temporary status. And so do you think that this president and Secretary Nielsen have done, or at least asked for that assessment to be made before making a decision to terminate? So that's the first part of my question. And then the second part is, do you think Liberia is ready to absorb all of the people that are going to be returned back to it? And will that maybe harm any peace or stability it might currently have?
I would assume, and I don't know, that any assessments that are required have been done either by our embassy or by the State Department, but I can't answer that question with any...
We have not been able to see one, so.
So again, I don't know the answer to that. Again, having lived in Liberia for 4 years and worked on Liberian issues my entire life, I know the country quite well. I think the country will have difficulty absorbing a large number of people because they're having difficulties dealing with the economic challenges of the people who are living there now. That said, in terms of the safety factor, we were dealing with a country that was at war for 14 years, where people were being killed regularly. That does not happen in Liberia anymore. I did find Liberia to be safe.
I'm going to go to Mr.
Yeah.
Burchett, and then we'll do another round.
I could yield a minute if she wants to finish her thoughts. I hate to come back. She might have to go somewhere. I've got to go somewhere too, but I'll be.
I got time.
You good? Okay. Well, thank you, Chair Lady, Ranking Member, Ms. Omar. I had about 2 or 3 different questions, and I'll try to hit them pretty fast because I know our time's limited. As y'all know, violent extremist groups threaten state stability, regional security, and our national interests in Africa. And I want to focus mainly on the Lake Chad Basin region in Boko Haram. What are your thoughts on this terror group now that the Islamic State has recognized a rival faction as opposed to Abu Bakr Shekau? Does this fragmentation make them more or less of a threat? Go ahead, ma'am. In that pretty outfit, I'm going to call on you first, if that's all right, Chair Lady. Am I allowed to do that?
I think the threat that Boko Haram and any groups that have spiraled from that organization continue to have a major impact in the region. We've seen that impact in northern Nigeria. We've seen it in Chad, in Niger, and further afield. And this is why I think it's important that we continue to engage with African countries to address this issue, because terrorism, wherever it happens, impacts all of us. When there was an attack on a hotel in Mali a couple of years ago, an American citizen was killed in that attack. So we're not safe if we're not working with those countries to address these issues.
Yeah, no, I think the Lake Chad region more broadly, if you look at it, it's basically where issues like terrorism, climate change, state fragility all come together. And the solution, in my view, to this, and she has to be a long-lasting one that is able to encompass both economics as well as security interventions. If you take the Lake Chad region, for example, in 2063, we had a bedshed of about 25,000 square kilometers. Now it's only 2,500 square kilometers due to climate change. So it's now 1/10 of what it used to be. So what that has done is create conditions for conflict that is affecting now about 50 million people or so in that region. So I think a comprehensive approach needs to be taken to the solution if we want it to really be long-lasting and impactful.
Yeah, I think the terrorism challenge associated with Boko Haram and its splinter group is profound. The good news is that Boko Haram has lost most of its strongholds over the last number of years because of this multinational force. But the Nigerian government has been unable to deliver the security and the services and other things that are necessary to really stabilize the Northeast. So Boko Haram has survived and is now actually resurgent, I would say, as is its splinter group, ISIS West Africa Province, which just at the beginning of this year conquered hundreds of square miles of territory in 3 different countries. They are establishing a state. They are now administering it in some ways. It's not nearly as extensive, of course, as the ISIS state was in the Middle East, but those are clearly their aspirations. And they've made very serious gains in recent times. So it's a very difficult problem set. And it's in a belt, as my colleague just mentioned here, where you have all sorts of very negative trends converging that makes it very hard to eliminate these groups.
Thank you. One more, if I have time, Chair Lady, or one more question. Thank you, ma'am. I'm concerned about the investments that China is making, and I'm wondering what the U.S. should be doing to counter some of the influence that they are having in Africa. And to what extent are some of these investments a threat to our interests, including our diplomatic development and security objectives? And to follow up with that, if the United States were to significantly reduce its foreign aid to Africa, do you all feel like China would seek to fill the gap, and how they would do that?
China, over, I would say, the past decade, has gone into Africa fast and furiously. They have changed their approach. It's evolved over time. Initially, they would go in and do a stadium or some small project and to buy influence. Now they're doing major infrastructural projects. The issue at hand is that all of these infrastructural projects, some of them better than others, are needed on the continent of Africa. Africans need railroads, they need roads, they need refurbished airports and ports. And we have ceded that space to China. And it's important if the U.S. sees its role as competing, and I don't see us as competing with China because I think we have different resources that we bring to the table. We're not going to bring those large projects. I think a better approach for us to take is to work with our African partners to ensure that they have the capacity to strike and negotiate better deals with the Chinese. Because again, the kind of deals that they're getting with the Chinese, we don't have the wherewithal to do that. But we need to pay attention to what is happening because our influence on the continent is waning in comparison to China. And if we start to decrease our foreign aid, the Chinese will come in some way or another to support these countries. They're not going to come in with the same values that we bring to the table. And in my conversations with Africans, leaders and business people alike, their preference is to have the United States there. And their question to us every day is, where are you? Why are you not there? And you can't tell us we can't engage with the Chinese if you're not prepared to engage with us.
Did anybody else want to respond to that?
No, I just wanted to underscore the ambassador's point. So the really best way to counter China, if that was the objective, really is to solve Africa's infrastructure problem. It is really huge.
Say that again, I'm sorry,
It's to
I'm
solve,
from East Tennessee, and
is to solve Africa's infrastructure problems. I mean, the demand is just huge. Huge because of the low point where they're starting from, given the stage of economic development, but also huge because they're experiencing really rapid demographic growth and rapid rate of urbanization. The estimates put it at about $130 to $170 billion a year. That's what's needed for infrastructure financing in Africa. And 2/3 of that amount, or 60% or more, is unfunded. And I think that's what China has aligned itself with the African nations, and that's why they're responding positively. But I'm hopeful that at least as we roll out the development finance corporations that was passed as part of the BUILD Act, that's going to be able to come in and allow the U.S. to begin to play more in that space.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Did you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think I agree. I don't think the message to our African partners should be us or them. That's not going to work because China does provide certain things that African countries need. But helping African countries strike better deals, as the ambassador mentioned, with China is really important, but also providing an alternative. We can't do that, frankly, on most big infrastructure projects because we don't have a lot of companies that do that sort of thing. We don't heavily subsidize them as the Chinese government does with its state-owned, obviously, enterprises. So we need to look at competitive advantages that the United States has. Which industries do we have a real obvious advantage? Focus on those. And I think that we need to, in terms of the larger competition with China, where we do compete is around the model. Beijing is increasingly pushing this idea to African countries that you can have economic growth, but you just need to crack down on your pesky journalists and your civil society and things of that nature, as we do, and look at how successful we've been. So there is an obvious competition there, and the U.S. needs to engage in that competition of ideas especially, and make sure we're messaging properly about the benefits of democracy, of the free enterprise system, and things of that nature.
You know, let me continue with that, because I think one of the big concerns right now is we're not really sending a strong message from the administration in that regard to counter that. And, you know, my experience along with the witnesses, and I'm sure many people in the room, is that the African countries would rather do business with us, but we're not in a position to tell them they should turn their backs on China when China is there and we are not. And really the question is, you know, for us to step up our involvement. And so to my colleague from Tennessee, two things. You know, one, hopefully, because you were asking the question about security, hopefully if you're available, you could attend the CODEL, the congressional delegation, because that's exactly what we want to look at. And then in terms of Africa's infrastructure, we are working on a piece of legislation we're calling Move Africa, that the purpose is to incentivize U.S. businesses to do transportation-related infrastructure projects. And so I think that overall, our perspective on Africa, we treat the continent, frankly, like we treat inner city communities, which is from a point of view of charity, as opposed to partnership, and recognizing that on the African continent there are tremendous opportunities. It seems like the rest of the world knows that, but we're a little bit, you know, late to the party. So we need to, you know, improve our game. My questions are really focused on what we need to do here in Congress to improve the situation. So one of the issues is our designation of middle-income countries that then makes some countries not eligible for like MCC and other programs. And I wanted to know if anybody on the panel has any solution as to how we should come up with what formula we should use, because if we just use income, it doesn't take into account the inequity. So, you know, the annual income of somebody might be $15,000, but we know that that's averaged because people at the top are making so much. So I would like to take a look at middle-income countries, that designation, since I believe it excludes so many other countries. In terms of Mozambique, want to know your thoughts on if we are doing enough. Should we be providing more assistance? On the issue of Sudan, there's a lot of people that are concerned with what is happening in Sudan right now, and the Obama administration and the Trump administration was continuing, I don't know about a rollback, but I mean, you know, the different phases, and we haven't gotten to phase 2, but there's some push here in Congress to actually move back to sanctions, you know, in a much bigger way, as opposed to the movement forward toward normalization of relationships. And so my question is, given what is happening in Sudan right now, do you think the time is now for us to strengthen sanctions, strengthen state sponsor of terrorism in terms of that designation? And by strengthening it, I mean in removing it from the administration deciding to, you know, having to have congressional approval, which is actually kind of the way it is now, but restating it and making it stronger, stricter before we would consider lifting it. So I'll start with those, and I'll start with Madam Ambassador, go down the reg, and then if Representative Omar has additional questions she'd like to ask, we'll go there.
I'm going to bunt a little bit on the designation of middle-income countries, because I'm not sure it's it's just the U.S. that makes that designation. And I'm aware of several countries who benefited from MCC,
Right.
and then suddenly they no longer benefited because they'd moved up the scale. So we punish them for their improvements.
Yeah, well, we do that domestically too. So
Yeah,
as soon
so
as you
we-
get better, we cut you off.
So we need to look at, I agree that we need to look at it. I don't know
But
how
where does
it's-
that designation come from? That's not, is it UN or?
I'm not aware of really a precise scientific method that has allowed for that delimitation.
Well, I'm sure it's not scientific. I just wonder where it came from.
I
Well, I'm glad you guys don't know. That means there's room there then.
There is room there.
Okay.
On Mozambique, Madam Chair, there is so much to be done there. The pictures that we're seeing coming out of Mozambique are just horrifying. And I know that the U.S. is there on the ground along with others. I think we were a little bit late in responding. It was almost a week before it even started getting press coverage here in the United States. So again, I think our colleagues from USAID and the State Department are actively engaged. Our military is engaged, but I think it's going to take more engagement and more resources for them. So I think we need to look at the resource base that they're working from and see if there are any possibilities of increasing the funding and the resources that they have to respond to this.
Well, it's appropriation season, so it's definitely time for us to look at that.
And on Sudan, you know, your question is an interesting one. I think part of what is happening in Sudan is because of what we have been working toward in the Sudan. So I do think, and again, I'm coming from a position of having worked on this issue during the Obama administration, but I do think that we should continue the path we are on with them, continue pushing and pressuring the government. Part of the reason the government is responding to our pressure is because they want this to continue. And on the issue of state sponsor of terror, they have regularly told us that we have continued to move the goalpost on them on that particular issue. And I believe that this is an unrelated issue, but I suspect that the handwriting is on the wall in Sudan, and the transition and the changes that are taking place are changes that we have all been watching and waiting for. And I think any efforts on our part to pull back now may send the wrong signal. The government may decide there's no reason that they can't really crack down. And they have, I think they've been somewhat restrained.
Thank you.
On the issue of the middle-income country delimitation, so Although I'm not aware of scientific method that determines it, one of the guiding principles of it is that these are countries that have reached a certain stage whereby they can now tap into the markets to meet the other type of financial
But
needs.
it's not true.
Yes, it's not exactly always true. One perhaps approach, and I think you're right, that with inequality, sometimes you may have the income and the country as a whole at a high level of income, but many parts of it still struggling. And I think that was an important clause of the BUILD Act in setting up the US IDFC to recognize there could be needs even to act in upper middle income countries where it's showing that some segments of the populations are still struggling. So one possibility then is to start there, but then to also look at the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
The Sustainable Development Goals, there's now measures coming out.
Yeah.
Including
Are
some
you saying maybe look at both? Because if you look at if you add in the Sustainable Development Goals, then it goes south. You know what I'm saying? Because just because you've reached an income status, that doesn't mean you've achieved those goals at all.
Well, I think the Sustainable Development Goals should be taken certainly into account, particularly some of the priority area targets, right? So we can start there,
Yeah.
and then see which are the countries that are way off track. If you look at, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, the poverty rates we've been tracking out of Brookings, some of my colleagues' work, show indeed that the continent, the poverty number of people, poor people, are exactly increasing. But if you take a closer look, a large part of it is due to Nigeria, for example, which many would classify as being in a better income level than some other countries. But Nigeria is one of the countries that is way off track. So
Do you know a country where they've graduated to middle income status where they can actually tap into the world markets?
So I think you take a country like South Africa, I think they can tap into markets. And over the past, since 2006, we've had about over a dozen countries across Africa that have tapped into the global financial markets for the first time. But I also subscribe that some of them may have tapped into it while not being fully ready to take on more debt than they should be taking on. And you may very well know that there's now an issue of whether Africa is facing another debt crisis.
To China.
Yeah, reminiscent. China's part of it, but there's also the markets precisely. A lot of Euro bonds have been issued. And then there's a question then as to whether we're facing again another debt forgiveness episode like what we've seen earlier in the decade. So I think starting with the SDGs, trying to see whether we can come in and then assess really the alternative sources of financing that they might have. Do they really have access to markets at a reasonable cost, like it's sometimes portrayed to be? And then speaking of debt, and then Mozambique, to get to your question on Mozambique, I think they could definitely use help because it's one of the countries that have had debt level that is over 100% of GDP, and they're now classified as being in debt distressed. So there's really not much scope from them to mobilize their own resources to deal with this tragedy. And I think they could use as much help as possible, especially if the regional actors as well as the US is able to step in a leadership role to galvanize more support for Mozambique.
Mr. Manservi?
Yeah, on Mozambique, I agree. I think a critical part of this will also be a sustained effort because the level of devastation is really extraordinary, and this is going to be a long-term challenge. So, yes, obviously the disaster response is crucial, and the U.S. is involved in that and should continue to look for opportunities to ramp up its engagement. But certainly thinking through, okay, after a week has passed or 2 or 3 weeks, how do we continue to help ameliorate some of the fallout of this crisis? And then just quickly on Sudan, I think it's important to keep what is happening as far as protests are concerned separate from phase 2 because they are in some ways separate issues. So I don't think that any sort of activity or actions by the U.S. to punish what Sudan is doing, and they have engaged in a brutal crackdown, to use the phase 2 negotiations as the vehicle, I don't think that's the best vehicle to use. I think it's very appropriate to think about global magnanimity, for instance, or some other avenue that we have, because the Sudanese government has responded brutally, and they should be held accountable. but it is a separate issue from the Phase 2 negotiations.
Thank you. Representative Omar?
Dr. Kalibali, you talked about the youth in Africa, on the continent. You said 40% of the world's population are going to be in Africa, and 42% of the workforce will be in Africa. And when we were in Ethiopia and Eritrea just recently, a lot of the young people talked to us about the hopes and aspirations that they have as they move into the world in ways that we can invest. So I just wanted to see if you had an idea of one particular investment we can make as a country to assist the youth in Africa that would make a real impact.
Yes, I would emphasize the area of education and skills. I think, as I mentioned, 42% of the global workforce. Now imagine that workforce being imparted with the kind of skills of the 21st century. So this would really be a global, not just African, economic success and the opportunity. It's going to really expand the global middle class and create market opportunities that everybody is going to benefit from. But when you look at the educational systems, they're being crammed because of precisely that demographic growth. The infrastructure in classroom, we touched on that earlier, is not keeping up with that boom. So in classes where you're supposed to have 40 students, you now have like 80 students or 100 students. In that context, it's becoming difficult to test them. The quality of the education itself, even the lucky ones who get one, could be decreasing. And another area where this could be helpful is to leverage technology, for example. Initiatives that can bring technology to education can allow to maintain that quality and be able to scale it up.
Oh, that's wonderful. I was just meeting with some tech folks from Africa, and when the Black Caucus has its conference in September, I hope that will be my sort of sessions around technology and investments that we could make in Africa. So we'll see how that goes. But I wanted to come back to something that was in the testimony of Ms. Servi. Am I saying that right? All right. You had mentioned in your testimony that Saudi Arabia has promoted Wahhabism in Africa, and that has contributed to the rise of jihadist thinking and terrorist recruitment on the continent. I would say, you know, we could sort of agree on that. Is it fair to say that our unwavering support for the Saudi government has been counterproductive to our security goals in Africa?
Saudi Arabia is one of those very difficult situations because there's no doubt that they are an important counterweight to Iran in the Middle East, which, as we know, is involved in all sorts of nefarious activities in Syria and beyond. But I also, as you referenced in my testimony, I think there's no doubt that their activities, and it's not just Saudi Arabia that's engaged in this, but they've been the primary and the most aggressive in proselytizing in this way. That I think that presents a long-term strategic challenge to the United States and to African countries. Frankly, African governments are concerned about this phenomenon as well. So I think that the U.S. has addressed this, or I know it has, with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It needs to do more, and I also think it needs to press Saudi Arabia to think, okay, how do you put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak? Like they've proselytized this all across the world. Now what? How do you start rolling this back? Because I think it's it's very much part of their responsibility to work on that. Now, whether their domestic politics will ever allow them to do that is an entirely different question, but I think that's part of the message the U.S. should be sending.
Okay, so let me see if I understand. They're spreading this ideology, and then we have reports that they're actually funding terrorists, but we are partnering with them to help us fight the ideology and terrorism? Is that what you're saying? That's the suggestion?
Well, it's two separate ideologies.
You're
we're
the
talking
problem,
about.
and we use you to fix the problem?
Yeah. Well, so Iran is.
No, I get that. I'm just saying on Saudi Arabia.
Sure.
So they're the problem, but we're also going to partner with them to fix themselves, and the problem that they're creating is precisely what you said, right?
Well, unfortunately, these are the sorts of decisions you have to make in foreign policy sometimes. And so in the Middle East arena, we have this very obvious problem of a country, talking about Iran, that has, for instance, during the Khobar Tower bombings, killed scores of American soldiers. They did in Afghanistan. They've been aggressive enemies of the United States.
Yeah.
So there's that sphere. And then you have this other sphere of this Wahhabist problem that I referenced. And I think you can do both. It's one of those strange bedfellow situations, but it's the unfortunate reality, frankly, of the Middle East. And so
I hear you. I appreciate that. It is a challenge, but one that is not often looked at with clear lenses. So in your testimony, you also mentioned that 12 of the 23 countries most affected by terrorism are in Africa. In the report, you referenced Somalia, which is where my family is from and I was born in. It's ranked 6th in the world and 2nd in Africa after Nigeria in terms of impact of terrorism. As you know, the major part of U.S. strategy of combating al-Shabaab in Somalia has been the use of drones. Under the Trump administration, drone strikes in Somalia have tripled, now totaling more than Libya and Yemen combined. AFRICOM denies any civilian casualties resulting from drone strikes in Somalia. But this is contradicted by reports from numerous investigative journalists and human rights organizations. Just last week, Amnesty International released a report, which I will be submitting for the record, a report documenting the killings of 14 civilians in just 5 drone strikes. AFRICOM confirms that 4 of the strikes were conducted by the United States, but denies any civilian casualties took place. Their spokesperson said that the way they determined civilian casualties is not available to Amnesty International or indeed any other non-military resource. My question to you is, do you find this to be credible in the face of overwhelming reports that are to the contrary, and that we have not killed any civilians in the decades of drone strikes that we've had in Somalia?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So a couple thoughts. One, I know that the U.S. military takes every effort to avoid civilian casualties. It's part of their SOPs. It's part of the ethic to which they subscribe. I also know that there's a fog of war in a place like Somalia, and that given the context of the conflict there, it's very difficult sometimes to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. So it's you can even have
Could a drone strike be 100% accurately, right, attacking, or could
I think
a
it's
report
possible.
that says 100% no civilian?
So that's
Could
actually
that be correct? Is what I'm asking you.
Yeah, I think it's possible, but I think it's frankly impossible to know, given how what a non-permissive environment it is. How do you even gather the facts on the ground in some of these places? that are still controlled by al-Shabaab. You can't go there safely. And again, how do you distinguish between a combatant and a non-combatant when you have farmers who are armed sometimes, some join al-Shabaab and then leave, and then join again and leave. So it's incredibly difficult. And so I think it's possible that civilians have been killed. I also think it's possible, maybe not. For me, it's frankly impossible to know, I think.
Right. I hope it's not, and it's a very challenging thing, which, you know, it's one of those situations, whether we're making an investment to infrastructure or figuring out if we invest in education or how to best fight terrorism, if we're not truly finding a path to have partnerships with the individual countries that are being impacted, then we sort of are short-ending ourselves and them. And any investment that we're making really truly is not ever going to have the kind of impact that we want it to have, because there is a correlation between some of the reports say that there are correlations between every drone attack and the increase of suicide bombs that happen in Somalia. And so when we're trying to be effective in combating terrorism, but our actions could lead to an increase, then we get to have a problem. If we're investing in education and we're saying, you know, we're going to be sending you books, but we don't really make the investment that the communities themselves need, where they need a brick and mortar investment, then there is a problem. If we're talking about diplomacy and we're not really having a conversation about what it means for us to send thousands and thousands of Liberians back to a country that could be fractured by that, without having the proper conversations with the government of Liberia, whether they could sustain that, then it's a problem. And I hope that as we continue to have a conversation about Africa, that we engage Africa in what that process looks like.
Okay, I just have one last question, and then we'll wrap up. I believe a couple of you mentioned the idea that we needed to have a second African Leaders Summit. And I wanted to know if you would just expand on that. How do we do that now?
I was part of the planning for the first Africa Summit that took place in 2014. I saw the positive impact that came from that summit, bringing African leaders from across the continent to the United States to engage with our leaders. Other countries are doing it on a regular basis. China has one, I think, every other year. The Japanese host one every other year. The Europeans are hosting one.
Well, the question would be who would host it?
Who would host it?
Right. I mean, the issue would be, would the African leaders respond to Congress?
I think they would. I think they would respond to a request to come to the United States by President Trump. They want to engage with our leadership. They want to engage on issues that are important to them. And I think it will send a positive signal if the president were to invite them to.
Well, so what I said was Congress.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm just saying that just because I don't know, you know what I mean, in terms of the administration. If the administration was not interested in doing it, and is there another way you would convene a leaders summit?
When I think about the prayer breakfast and how many leaders come to that, I think an invitation from our Congress would probably, you may not get all 54, but you would get a significant enough number that it would be successful, and others would be, the ones who didn't come would regret that they had not come, and it would, it could, you can set some goals to achieve during this conference, and I think leaders would respond.
To my ranking member, when we, as Representative Omar mentioned, we went to Eritrea and Ethiopia, and we're just so excited about the potential in Ethiopia and the fact that the Prime Minister has established peace with Eritrea, and they're trying to come together on the Horn, that it would be nice to invite the Prime Minister over. Maybe he could even address both houses of Congress. We have that happen occasionally, as to send a strong signal. So if either of you have any other closing thoughts?
No, I think I was actually even going a step further to suggest a regular, every 3-4 years, kind of a summit between U.S. and African head of states. That kind of gives us an agenda to work toward and some clear targets to achieve by then. But then in between, there are obviously lower level staff that engage and across the different African governments and the U.S. agencies, et cetera, to prepare for the summit, but also to work on what came out of the summit. And as the ambassador mentioned, it's been a resounding success for all the countries who are holding those regular meetings in terms of advancing the agenda in Africa. And it's really one place where there's a feeling that the U.S. is missing. So I think that is very critical. When the U.S. held the summit in 2014, you think about $14 billion or so was mobilized as far as U.S. businesses' investment intentions in Africa. So clearly there's scope for it to really boost U.S. commercial ties on the continent. Just one point in closing, it's basically level of the engagement with Africa. There's really a strong tendency now or aspiration for Africa to unite and then to take some regional approach to some issues that are of mutual interest. And you may be very well aware of the Africa Continental Free Trade area that is advancing. Yes. And I think as of—
How many countries are left? That's
as of last week, we're one vote away, one signature away from it coming into full effect.
Good.
However, I think as outlined too in Ambassador Bolton's strategy, but also some commentary that came out of the AGOA summit over the summer, there's the U.S. approach and that of the African counterparts is not quite fully sinking quite yet. The U.S. is currently talking bilateral engagement, while the African countries are talking regional engagement. So hopefully there could be some middle grounds where they would feel like—
That's a little bit of the disconnect.
Yes, so they would feel like
that it's an administration is Congress's.
It's an important one because it's going to signal to what extent the U.S. is supportive of the regional initiatives for integration. And we know that they need that integration because the states are sort of small states.
Right.
And there's kind of scale that comes with that integration that can help boost economic opportunities and competitiveness on the continent. For example, intra-Africa trade is only 17%. Mm-hmm. But you look at intra-European trade, 70%. Asia, 60% plus. Here in North America, you're looking at 30% or more. So it is indeed quite important and critical. So as I begin to think about the post-AGOA architecture for U.S.-Africa engagement, taking into account that regional dimension would be important.
And I think it's right to think about post-AGOA, but we do still have a few more years left. And so I would also like to think about how do we maximize the time.
Yes, if we're able to have something even strike earlier, I think the better. But
it is right to think about
But clearly the thinking should be going on now. And if you look at the European Union at their summit in 2017, they made a promise to actually go toward a continent-to-continent kind of arrangement. And you look at China during FOCAC, they try to align their programs with Africa's aspirations, such as the Continental Free Trade Area, for example. So it's important also in the U.S.'s engagement to incorporate the views and aspirations of the African people, to align the two agendas.
You would think. Final thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would like to see a routine U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit as well for all the mention or for all the reasons that Dr. Coulibaly laid out. I also think regular meetings between the president in the Oval Office with a head of state, an African head of state, maybe once a quarter or something. That these high-level engagements really matter. That's CODELs are important. I'm glad when those happen. Just to maybe give some, to put a point on this, President Xi Jinping, in each of his 2 terms, his first overseas trip was to Africa. Mm-hmm. The Chinese foreign minister's first overseas trip every year is to Africa. They understand the importance of this high-level engagement, and the U.S. this is one of the areas the U.S. needs to do better. Yeah,
and I think, one of our challenges is to, as I've learned in Congress, administrations come and go, but Congress stays the same. So I think all of us would love to see high-level engagements, but we can't control that. And so, and I do know from talking to a number of heads of state that they want to come over here, but frankly, it's a little inappropriate unless they meet the head of state. And they've not received an invitation from the president. So a number of them have not come because it's like, I can't go over there until, so that's a little bit of a dilemma, and I would really
argue
like to.
against that, though,
Okay,
Madam.
please.
I know that the president of Ghana has been here
Yes, that's
several
true.
times, and he's had very good meetings on the Hill with the private sector, with his diaspora. When I meet with African leaders and they tell me they don't want to come because they can't get a meeting with the president, I tell them they're missing out on the opportunity to meet with you.
Okay, and you know what? As actually, the president of Ghana is in the U.S. right now. I mean, he's going to be speaking at Harvard in a day or so, and we both recently met with the president of Sierra Leone. And maybe we could ask them to take that message back, because I could see us having consistency with leaders, but it's not, we can't speak for whatever, administration is going to come and go. Well, I want to thank everyone for the time, the patience, and just in closing, a couple of closing comments. We had said that we were doing this hearing, and we're going to do several more that really we're calling Africa 101, is to just give the broad strokes as to where the continent is, where U.S. policy is, to figure out where we go from here, recognizing that we do have some immediate crises and issues that we need to attend to right away, but to provide the members of the committee with the broad overview of U.S.-Africa relations. So I want to thank the witnesses and members for being here today, and if there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. You're welcome. You're welcome. The next hearing we'll do with the Assistant Secretary, but we couldn't do that until